The topic of near-death experiences is something I've discussed and looked at extensively on my YouTube channel and other platforms. But for those who are relatively new to this topic, curious if you can share a little bit about what one of these experiences is actually like.
Mm.
What are some of the core characteristics that define a near-death experience?
So generally, the narrative of a near-death experience is one has some sort of issue where, and it's not always the case, but one often has an issue where they are physically close to death, cardiac arrest, falling down, hitting their head, being hit by a car, something like that. Then they find themselves out of their body, which is difficult to imagine and impossible to imagine for those like myself and yourself who have never had an experience. Although you've had psychedelic experiences which are similar, I don't have that experience to draw on, so it's I'm using what I imagine it to be. They come out of their body is how they describe it, and they can often see themselves in the situation where they are. So if they're in a hospital room, they can see themselves on the bed, and the doctor's fussing over them. Not always, but that's quite often reported. Then they find themselves often feeling the sensation of being sucked away, almost like up a vacuum. Sometimes you hear about the light at the end of the tunnel. That's quite kind of idealized. It doesn't always happen, but there are cases where people find themselves sucked through a tunnel or a passage or a gateway or something. But it's actually not as common as people would believe. Others just kind of pop from one place to another, and that other is some form of non-physical reality, which is it's often different, but in the same time at the same time very similar in certain degrees. It seems to be very dependent on one's belief, background, geographical location, etc., 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 culture. But it's always usually a very nice environment where people will go. They'll say that it feels so much more real than when they were in their body, than anything that we're feeling now would feel like a dream compared to if we were to go to these places. They then often meet discarnate individuals or beings, I suppose, that aren't in a physical body but exist in this location. Sometimes, if they have people who have passed before them, it will be loved ones that they that have passed. Sometimes it will be religious figures such as Jesus or Muhammad or the Buddha, or would have a deity one believes in. Sometimes they're just unknown spiritual beings, usually of light, which is often a light so bright that it kind of hurts your eyes, but you don't have eyes to hurt. So it's if you haven't had it, it's very difficult to explain. That's also the same sort of light that people see at the end of the tunnel. And these beings that are made of this light, if they aren't related to a loved one or a deity, they just tend to be these benign, kind, loving beings. And often, but again, not always, these beings will take the person somewhere, or because it's difficult because time and space are kind of described as not existing, at least in the same way. So when I say they're taken somewhere, it's difficult to conceptualize, but they're taken somewhere where they have what's called a panoramic life review. And what that means is that the individual is, I don't know, sat on a throne or something, and they see before them all the experiences they've had in life. I mean, from conception to the current period where they're now in the hospital or wherever. And they're seeing all the experiences of their life from their own perspective and from the perspective of others that were involved. So say this person was a bully at school at 6 years old. They thought it'd be funny to kick a football or a soccer ball for you in this little kid's face and break his nose. They would see that experience and they would see how they felt doing it, what the results were for themselves, but they would also see the victim's point of view, what it was like to get kicked in the face by that soccer ball, and the consequences for that kid, his family, his loved ones, and the rest of his life. Maybe that incident caused him to develop, like me, some sort of anxiety disorder which lasted the rest of his life. That person would see that from his perspective, so he would feel that anxiety and he would feel the consequences of that action. And often the purpose of that is considered to be so that one can develop one's awareness and one's empathy and spiritual development, and by learning not only why the action was wrong, but also experiencing why the action was wrong. And they can then take that back and develop their lives ongoing. So that's the panoramic life review. Often as well, during this life review, they're also not just seeing these events, but they're taking part in them as well. So it's almost reliving it, but as I say, from their point of view and from the other's point of view, anybody else that's involved. Following that, generally, once the life review's over, they'll receive a message from these spiritual beings or from a discarnate voice, or again, when I say voice, it's often telepathic, or and not as such in a language, but just as a knowing, like the communicator, what the communicator is trying to put across is inherently understood by the person telepathically. So it's not like they hear inside their head words. They just understand what is being communicated to them contextually, conceptually. And often the final communication is it's not your time. You have to go back because you're not finished, or you've got work to do, or you've got more learning to do. And then you'll come back later. Sometimes then they'll feel themselves being pushed back through this tunnel, if there was one, or through this vacuum back into their body, or they'll just appear back in their body. Sometimes they pass through, as I say, the tunnel back through the hospital room, seeing themselves from outside, then into their body. Other times they just come back to in their body. And that's the general narrative. And there are nuances in between them, which are the aspects that I consider evidential or not so. But that is the general narrative of a near-death experience.